Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome. If you'd like to take your seats, I'm Kim Campbell, the Chief Executive here at the EMA, and if you hadn't noticed, there's actually an election on in New Zealand right now, for the first time, I guess, in many years, it's turning out to be actually an extremely interesting and, in some cases, quite entertaining election campaign. And so we're proud here at the EMA to, and as we do regularly from time to time, to bring our nation's leaders to our members to hear what they have to say about their plans, dreams, thoughts and hopes for New Zealand. Before that, a little bit of housekeeping. The usual safety stuff. Please put your phones on silent or turn them off because they can be annoying if they go off. The escape route, you can see a little sign with a little green man running. Our assembly point is actually in the car park in the front of the building. And the facilities, they're free here. You're welcome to use them at any time. Out the door on the right, in the corner of the building behind me there. It's, used to say a year is a long time in politics. It seems to me a day is a long time in politics right now. I think it's unprecedented, the changes that we've seen at the top of the various parties, which has, I think, particularly Materia resigning, Peter Dunn announcing his retirement and so forth, has certainly changed the dynamics of the electorate. And I think perhaps people's perceptions of what actually might happen in a few weeks' time. I'm grateful that we live in a democracy that is stable, that we're prepared to listen to each other, and even on earlier this week there was a room full of our politicians discussing what might happen with, I believe, is a great deal of civility, and it is pretty much a contest. Well, I mean, that was entertainment, which doesn't necessarily characterize elections in other jurisdictions, and also it is, in spite of maybe some celebrity antics, in the end there's a contest of ideas, and we invite people to focus on the ideas more than the personalities. This morning we're focusing on things that matter to business, and therefore we've invited the business leaders of the two main parties, Minister Stephen Joyce and Grant Robertson, and allowed enough time for an exploration of what really does matter for business. And I think you'll see as we go through this, and of course there'll be time at the end for plenty of questions, that we will indeed, in this election, have clear choices to make. And I would argue they're not going to be that easy to make. And for a large part of the electorate, they'll be quite conflicted. And frankly, when I look at the manifestos of all the parties, I could cherry pick bits from all of them that would be quite good for business. In fact, I've sort of got my dream team list of policies. You wouldn't get elected on that platform, I could say, but anyway, it would be very interesting. But then again, I'm not standing for elected office. And of course, before I close right now, regardless of who you vote for, regardless of what you think, the one thing that we all have is a franchise. And if you don't vote, don't complain. So with that, I'd like to welcome our Emcee for the morning, the world famous in Auckland, Mr. Mark Sainsbury.
Thanks, Kim.
Welcome, Mark.
Yeah, thanks very much, Kim. I'll just check. No, there've been no leadership changes overnight. Funny, isn't it? You never thought you'd actually have to do that, but these days in our business, we do. A lot of talk being about, personalities versus policies this election. What is great this morning is not suggesting they're devoid of personality, but today what you want to hear is policy and what the difference is going to be for business between the two leading contenders for be the next finance minister. So without further ado, can I please welcome to the stage Stephen Joyce and Grant Robertson. Here's how it's going to work. We're going to start off with just a very brief, 5 minutes max, outline from both of them about their priorities for business in the coming term. And then we're going to get on to 3 basically major issues, which are major issues for you guys, which of course is labour supply, enabling growth and development, and employment law. We want to leave time for questions at the end, not just from me, but from you. The whole point is to give you access directly to these guys. Just to get an idea, how many of you have got questions that you do want to ask these guys? Come on. All right, the rest of you think about it, because this is your golden opportunity. I reckon it's really, really important, and it's important, Kim as well believes it's really important that you have a chance to ask what you want to ask as well. So look, without further ado, you're here to listen to these guys. Let's start off Steve and Joyce, if you'd like to begin, just in terms of, as I said, the key priorities for business in this coming term.
Well, kia ora everyone. There's a slight shortage of where to put your coffee cup. It's wonderful to have the opportunity to say a few words this morning. Are you putting a timer on us, Mark, or are you? That's good. Okay, you got a timer. Excellent. It is wonderful to have the opportunity to come and say a few words. Grant and I see more of each other now than we see of anybody else we know. We're getting on pretty well, but there are still a few subtle differences, which you'll see over the course of the morning. Can I say this firstly? I want to congratulate you all on what you do. The New Zealand economy, as we know, is travelling pretty well at the moment. There's debate around the edges, but the New Zealand economy is growing at around the rate of 3%, has for the last few years, and according to all the prognosticators, is likely to do similar over the next few years, provided we keep doing the right things. And that's great, actually, because we're performing better than most other developed world countries, particularly in the last year, because the trend around the world post-GFC has been slow growth, and struggling to get away, and problems with, big problems with ongoing unemployment, particularly in Europe. And in this country, we have successfully navigated those issues, and we're taking on the world and doing a pretty good job with it. And that means that ultimately businesses are doing that. As somebody who comes from a background in commercial life, ultimately every decision to employ another person, every decision to invest a bit further comes from having the confidence to do so. And New Zealand has a great opportunity right now, particularly with the Asian consumer market, which is growing rapidly, which is fantastic. And I think we have the potential to really get out there and win over the next 20 or 30 years, which is just fantastic. But the way to do that is also to remember that we're actually a nation of small businesses, population still under 5 million, and all of our companies have to compete pretty hard to succeed on the world stage. All our exporters have to get out there and look bigger than they are. There's only one company really that is a world scale company, and that's Fonterra, and even that's not massive by world standards. The rest of us are all out there pretending that we have an army of Mandarin speakers and designers just sitting back at the office while we do our business with the Chinese or whomever. And because we're a nation of small businesses, it's really important that we're all rowing in the same direction. And I think that's important. And so from my perspective, the most important thing we can do in government is work with business and not against business. Because New Zealand is a nation of small businesses. Because we need to get out there and not ankle tap ourselves on the way to success. So we're very focused on creating that platform for growth. Many of you will be aware of the business growth agenda, things like skills, getting the right skills, both growing them domestically, bringing them in from offshore. The innovation space, we're seeing good growth in business R&D, not there yet, but good growth. We're seeing investment in infrastructure. Waterview is only the most obvious example of that. We're seeing the opening up of markets, really important that we're part of all the big trade deals, including TPP. All these things give us that platform for growth. And most of all, the platform to attract further investment. Because as you know, whether it's your shareholders or your bank or your accountant, you have to have the confidence to invest. And that's to be confident in the settings, the economic settings and the microeconomic settings that are actually delivering a platform that gives you that confidence. The other thing I'd point out is, of course, we've had the pre-election fiscal update this week, and that shows that New Zealand's books are in pretty good shape. And I think that's a real tribute to Bill as Finance Minister. Before me, I get to come along and go da-da, but actually the hard work has been done over the last several years. And it was interesting because I had an Australian bank economist come and see me earlier in the week, And we were chatting away about things, and he said, he stopped me at one point because I was assuming our position, 1 minute, was assuming that our position, I was just basically taking for granted that we were in surplus. And he says, you know what you guys don't understand is just how many more choices you have as a country and how many more opportunities you have because the country has done the hard yards and got back into surplus. So Australia's going that way, the US is going that way, the UK is going that way, and in New Zealand, we've actually done the hard work, we're into surplus, which gives us the opportunity to continue to invest and also do the things that are really important for Kiwis to see the benefits of a growing economy. Biggest one, of course, is jobs, 180,000 jobs the last 2 years, 200,000 over the next 4 years predicted. That's the big story of opportunity for New Zealanders more broadly rather than just the business sector, the security of a permanent full-time job. So that's the mission that we have, is to work with business, not against business, and make sure that we can turn the next few years' opportunity into the success we all know is possible. Thanks very much.
Grant Robertson.
Oh, well, kia ora, good morning. Thank you very much to the EMA for the invitation to come and the team for organising us to be here. It is true that Stephen and I are seeing a lot of each other. I'm somewhat alarmed that we're starting to have breakfast together now after everything else that we do together. That's right, yeah, that's, yeah, no, not quite going steady, but yeah. So, yeah, no, I think we're both pleased. Look, I want to start today by making the acknowledgement that at the high level indicators, the New Zealand economy does look good, and that's down to the hard work of a lot of people in this room and outside, and that there are some people doing very, very well in the period of time that we live in. But I do encourage you all to take a look at the next level down in terms of indicators. So yep, growth rates of around 3.5%, but on a per person basis, much, much less than that. And relative to the rest of the world, not quite the standout performer that we might be at that high level. And it is very important to look at that because in the end, a strategy for the economy that's built on population growth is not a sustainable strategy. And that's the message that I've got for you today. There is no, it's a bit of a false dichotomy to say that people will either be for or against business. That's ridiculous. The Labour Party stands here today wanting to work with you as we did when we were last in government and as we will do when we come into government. We understand the importance of the private sector and our economy and growing jobs. We're here to be a partner with you in helping the economy grow. And our concern is that in the numbers that Stephen brought out this week, we still see a continuation of very, very flat productivity growth, labour productivity growth. We are in a productivity recession. Stephen doesn't like this, but it's true. In the last 4 years, we have seen productivity growth go backwards. We do need to be doing better than that. Actually, in the last 2 quarters, GDP per capita has been going backwards as well. So yes, we have a solid economy that's operating, but we can't be complacent and we do need policies that will drive us forward rather than see a bit more of drift. What we've done this year is come forward to you with a framework to show how we're going to manage the economy. So that's called our budget responsibility rules. We laid those out in March. Essentially, they guarantee that we will work to sustainable surplus, lower debt as a ratio of GDP of 20% within 5 years, focus on some of the long-term challenges that we're facing, and we demonstrating that by committing to restart our contributions to the super fund right away on taking office because we can't afford to let that challenge drift. The question of tax, which has been getting a lot of attention in the last few days. 2 years ago, I announced that we would undertake a tax working group with the mandate to look at a better balance in our tax system. We don't believe the balance between how we tax assets and how we tax income is correct in New Zealand at the moment. We are in fact out of step internationally in that regard, and we don't believe we can continue to do that, and I'm happy to talk a bit more about how that group will work, but we do think it's an important part of what we do. And you have our commitment too that we will be careful in government spending, and that will stay at around the long run average of 30% of GDP under a Labour government. But the productivity challenge is hugely important, and we're going to come to some of this in the next 2 questions. But we do need to lift the skills of our workforce. It is essential when we face a rapidly changing world of work. And that is a partnership between government, employers and workers. And unless we get that right, we will not be able to get the productivity lifts that we want. Same with research and development and innovation, regional development. You need an active partner in the government making sure that we are continuing to find the ways of stimulating and helping lift productivity. And I just want to take one look at an example here, and that's the construction industry. Because you would think we would be seeing fantastic indicators. My apologies to the feature building people I talked to before. You would think that we would be seeing some fantastic indicators coming out of the construction industry, but actually residential investments projected to fall in the pre-fu numbers that Stephen put out yesterday. Well, it is, it's in the numbers. If you look at the last quarterly survey of business opinion, you've got 6% below the long-run average in terms of confidence in that construction industry. Now, why is that? Because there are concerns about the ability to have skilled staff. Now, we've recognised that in terms of our immigration policy by talking about having a Kiwi Build visa. Kiwi Build's our big residential construction project that we want to undertake, that actually says, yes, you will need to bring some people in, but we want you to be training apprentices at the same time. It's also where the productivity challenge matches. There's a great article by John Beveridge today in the Herald that's talking about the fact that we need to be doing more to encourage new models of development there. And in particular, we're looking at that in terms of prefabricated housing and partnering in the development in Gisborne of a new factory in that regard. That's what I mean. We need to be active partners in the economy supporting that growth and productivity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, now we're going to carry on with the debate. Look, the two of you can stay where you are. Ideally, what we'd like to do, if we can manage it, is just to get the less of me we hear, the more of you, the better. But the first now themes, and this is a really important one, I think, for everyone in the room, and this is labour supply. Where and how will business find the staff they need now and in the future? That we've talked about the growth. You talked about Stephen Joyce, 180,000 jobs being created, but we still hear there are skill shortages, businesses struggling to get staff. Let's start with you. What is it that you're doing that's going to ease the concerns in this room?
Okay, well, firstly, let's acknowledge the situation. We are approaching full employment in this country. We're expected to be unemployment down to 4.3. Auckland is already down to 4.5. So we're approaching full employment. So we need to do two things. One is we need to keep developing the skills of particularly young people, but also those who are in the workforce now that want to upskill. And then we also need to be open to skilled migration. And we would argue the levels are about where they need to be now, if not a little tight. And most other parties are arguing it should be less than what it is now. And I can't see that. We're a small country again. If our companies are going to grow, we have to provide that skilled labour. I think it's really important. In fact, a lot of people think that migration is driving the economy, but it's the other way around. It's the economy and the job opportunities that are driving migration. Otherwise, we wouldn't have it. Frankly, we'd still be exporting 30 or 40,000 people to Australia, which we were doing up until about 5 or 6 years ago. So in terms of the domestic skills, what we've done is actually, and continuing to do, is shift the focus towards more of the subjects in tertiary that the businesses need. Big focus on lifting engineering numbers, big focus on lifting software engineering numbers, industrial design, that's in the sort of in the provider-based training, and then a big focus on the trades, lifting the numbers of trades apprentices to get it to 50,000. Currently, if we talk construction, which Grant mentioned, we're 11,000 apprentices in construction, which is the most we've ever had. Question is it enough given the country's growing? And that's the challenge, is keep bringing kids into these trades. That's why we're reforming Careers New Zealand, putting it into the TEC to work with industry to get far better, more passionate advocates for those industries into the schools. At the moment, we've still got a bias towards university level education, which we're working to solve, but frankly, it's a school by school effort. Some of them are good at it, some of them aren't.
Haven't we known this for a while, though? I mean, the skill shortages we see now are not a surprise.
Oh, no, well, they are because you are seeing such strong employment growth. But yeah, we've been working on it for a while. But sadly for you and for me, Mark, we don't get to wave a magic wand and turn out engineers tomorrow that haven't yet started at university. So we started on the engineering program 5 or 6 years ago. And yes, we're graduating 500 more engineers now than we were 5 or 6 years ago, but it has to be an ongoing program.
Grant, I want to talk about what you would suggest in terms of developing those skills, but also they're not going to come in overnight. It's suddenly not going to be pouring out. So how do we handle the gap?
Yeah, and as I said when I spoke before, we absolutely accept that immigration is an important part of ensuring we get the right skilled people in New Zealand and continue to grow the economy. So we're not saying that's not a focus. What we've proposed is that we need to look at the mix of that. We need to make sure that we're not seeing the massive growth in very low value tertiary courses that then lead to people being able to stay in New Zealand for an extended period and not providing the high level of skills that are needed. So that will be part of the picture. But I do think, Mark, it is the job of government to go right back to the beginning here when it comes to how we develop that skilled workforce, and that actually does start in our schools. It means actually having a greater focus around integrating career development, career advice into the experience of every single school student. It's extremely patchy in New Zealand at the moment. If you go to one school, you may well get really good advice and guidance about your future career. If you go to another, you may get none at all. So we've proposed actually completely revamping the way we do that. Stephen's talked about moving Careers New Zealand into the TEC. I'm not completely convinced about that. I think the TEC needs a thorough relook as well. It's not doing the job that, and I'll put my hand up, that I was part of creating. It's not a strategic funding body. It's become a box-ticking organisation. We need a lot more of a strategic approach to the funding of tertiary education and those core skills starting to be developed at school. And then people in this room being partners in how we ensure that we don't have school leavers who are not going into employment or education or training. And at the moment, Stephen will contest the numbers, but they're there. There are 70,000 of those people. We can be doing so much better with them while we're continuing the other training.
Stephen, Joyce?
A couple of things. So firstly, the TEC is the Tertiary Education Commission. When I inherited it, it was led by a bunch of retired university vice-chancellors who were treating it as a bit of a sort of nice place to relax before permanent retirement. And so we've actually turned it into a body which is focused on the skill needs of industry. Some of you will know people like Phil O'Reilly, who's on the board there now, and some of the other senior business leaders who actually are focusing on directing the funding to the areas that are important. Now, one of the things that Grant and I disagree on a little bit is the emphasis on humanities. I think humanities has a place in our society. It's just that in New Zealand it has too big a place, in the sense that there's just too many kids doing humanities degrees as compared to engineering and ICT degrees and the sort of science degrees that actually we need. So I'm very much in favour of having humanities, but I do think the balance needs to shift towards the sort of degrees that help New Zealand high-tech companies and technology companies, which is where we're all going, grow a little bit more rapidly. In terms of the wider question of those kids that aren't in employment and education, there's about 29,000 that are available for work and not working, which is too many. Unfortunately, some of those kids have come from very challenging backgrounds, and in areas where we've been able to dive deeply into that, we're dealing with people who we have to actually work right alongside intensively for maybe a year or 15 months before they actually develop the work habits to stay in a job. And for the employers that we've been working up in the far north with, it's actually almost an act of altruism, which is what we need, frankly, to work alongside some of the agencies to bring these kids in and be prepared to develop them and be patient over a period of time. And that's what we're working on.
Just a couple of quick responses. I'll let Bill English know that his English literature degree is not useful or important.
Didn't say that.
Oh, well, no, that's what I heard.
The balance, my friend.
It is a balance. And of course, we want to be continuing to train people across the board. I guess one of the big lessons from the Future of Work Commission project that we did is that the skills that employers are constantly talking to us about are the ability to be creative, to collaborate well, to solve complex problems, and they come from a variety of different courses and programs. So I'm not going to be, prescriptive about that. I think that there is a range of skills that can be developed through different programs of study. But the other point I wanted to make, Mark, was that I think there has been an absence of a coordinated skills planning and leadership strategy. And as part of the work we've done, we've looked around the world, and you can take lots of different examples. Singapore is a very interesting one. They did a series of industry transformation maps where they went through with industries and said, where are you going in the next 10 to 20 years? What is the shape of the workforce that you will need? And then how do we work together to both train your existing workforce and encourage young people into those areas? And they've actively said we will support the retraining of people to do that. I think that's what we want. That's been in the past a tripartite approach, which when Labour was last in government, we ran the skills strategy through employers, unions and government. We need that to come back.
All right, one of the issues, I mean, we talked about trying to build up skills, getting people to develop, learning the right skills, bringing those into industry, but we know in the meantime there's going to be shortages. Immigration. Can we afford, Grant Robertson, to cut immigration given the skills shortages and the labour shortages that a lot of the people represented here today are facing?
Look, I think everybody in this city knows that the levels of immigration and migration that we've seen in recent times have stretched our infrastructure to beyond actually its capacity. So the whole point of what we've said is we need to invest generously in that infrastructure. We need to build the houses. We need to create the modern transport system, particularly that this city needs. And so while we do that, we tweak some of the settings. But look at what we've actually said, Mark. What we're focused on are those students who've come in doing low-value courses who are then getting an extra year's worth of visa. We're looking at the areas where we do believe there are New Zealanders who can be trained. But I can give a commitment to everybody in this room that we will be continuing to support those industries that need skilled people to come in, and there will be we will have a focus on those high-skilled people. We're actually going to increase the number of visas in those areas where there are truly high-skilled people. One of us is getting a phone call. Where there truly are those high-skilled people need, and to get those people into as well.
That's me ringing you. Can I just respond to a couple of things there? Firstly, you can't cut 20 or 30,000 people out of immigration without affecting everybody in this room who's looking for employees. That's just the reality of it. And so I think we're getting into a sort of area of where the numbers are just not going to make any sense. In terms of the makeup of New Zealand migrants, the OECD has done a look at all the countries and their migration and how it's working, and they say that New Zealand has the best level of migrants in terms of their skill levels in the world. That doesn't make it perfect, but we're just more perfect than everybody else in that context. And in particular, we're picking up people in their 20s and 30s, and part of that is graduates from tertiary education. Now, it's a complete mistake to say that that's actually low-level courses. You can't actually get access to stay in New Zealand unless you're completing at least something which is the same as a trade, i.e. level 5 or 6. So to suggest that that's low level, well, tradies might have a view on that. So it is really important that we acknowledge what's actually happening. And in terms of the future, we're putting a few fine-tuning, but Grant mentions the industries, that industries should be able to get, the industries that need them should be able to get them. I agree with him. So those industries are things like ICT, manufacturing, hospitality, the horticultural industry, the construction industry. So actually, when you look across, virtually every industry has shortages. And we have a question to ask ourselves, is do we want New Zealand to keep growing or not? Now, I, for one, say, yep, actually, we're not overcrowded. We can grow a little bit, and we can use that opportunity to build the sort of infrastructure like Waterview that makes a difference.
And growing business, of course, this is big. I'm just conscious of the time. I'll move into this next section, which is enabling growth and development. How do we drive productivity? How do we get businesses to succeed? One of the things you hear, talking to people here, and I remember 2008, after you guys came into power, and Rodney Hyde, who was the Minister of Local Government, saying, we are going to just reform that RMA. It is a handbrake to business. It is a handbrake to everything. We're going to deal to it. How many people in this room have confidence in the RMA? Come on, please. Oh, 1, 2. All right.
There you go.
I mean, this is the problem you've got. So what is the RMA for a start, Grant? Do you see that as a handbrake to business? As a handbrake to growth?
There are ways in which the RMA has been implemented that have made life difficult for some people and some individual businesses, and I think we can all acknowledge that. The real question we have to ask ourselves, though, is how does the RMA fit within our broader planning framework, within the broader growth agenda that we all have. I mean, I have a suspicion that if we decided we were all going to dump the RMA, something would be created that would end up looking a little bit like the RMA, because that's the nature of having to have a comprehensive piece of planning law. What I'm interested in is the interaction between the RMA, the Local Government Act, and how we facilitate sustainable growth in New Zealand. And so from our point of view, yep, sure, we could tweak the RMA. I've got a strong view that one of the reasons it hasn't worked as well as it should have is because we haven't had the level of national level policy guidance that was envisaged when the Act was originally written. You know, national environment standards and national policy statements have either been absent or weak. So that has not helped the individual implementation around the RMA. But actually what we want to do is, particularly in terms of urban development, look more towards the Urban Development Authority model where we bring the parties to the table. I know the EMA has been part of discussing with EDS and others how we actually can get that kind of sustainable growth to happen. So yep, we can play around with the RMA, but I think we need to look at the Local Government Act and we need to create new models to facilitate growth.
What needs to happen, Steve and Joyce, to encourage growth and productivity in this country?
Well, if we just deal with the RMA, first of all, what needs to happen there is we just need to get enough votes in the Parliament to make meaningful change. And actually, unfortunately, over the last 9 years, we've always come up 1 or 2 votes short. And actually, you listen to Grant, you hear exactly why that's the case. Because there's plenty of people that think that the RMA just needs tweaks. Well, we've tweaked it a number of times. We've done everything that we're able to do with the votes that we have in the Parliament, and yet it's still not delivering. So I think it's a very interesting discussion. I want to congratulate, firstly, Productivity Commission for the work they've done, then EDS, EMA, and Infrastructure New Zealand. But the fundamental question that we have to ask ourselves is the law as it is the right law? And Grant says, yeah, we've broadly come up with it. Again, well, I think there's 2 things that we should look at carefully, and they've been promoted by the Productivity Commission. One is a separate urban planning law, which is distinct from the law that we have in rural areas, because in the urban planning situation, often you're dealing with pre-existing infrastructure, brownfields and so on, and the ability to change that. So that's the first thing we've got to look at. Second thing is we have to actually have a decent discussion about whether the environmental effects legislation should be part of the planning legislation. We came to this in the late 80s. It was going to be the all singing, all dancing thing that the rest of the world would follow, that everything would be in one statute and that people would work it and it would be fantastic. Weirdly, the rest of the world hasn't followed. It's a little bit like the left-hand rule that was going to be fantastic and the rest of the world were going to follow. We ended up dumping it when I became Transport Minister, because the rest of the world didn't follow. And that's where we are with the RMA. So I reckon we need to do some work on that.
But Stephen, is that what you've described actually your policy?
Oh, but I'm just saying, that's the problem.
So it's not. That's the problem.
Well,
You've
actually,
just described
hang on a
something that
second.
isn't your solution.
Well,
So
I would just say,
I think
wait.
you want to be upfront with the people here about what you're actually proposing for the
Well,
RMA.
let's just wait a couple of weeks and you might find a little bit more out.
See, there you go, being tricky. Mark, I did want to come back. I did just want to come back on the question of broader productivity, because that was actually what you raised at the start. And I do think that is the number one challenge for New Zealand at this stage. We have, we simply are not seeing the output per hour growth that we should be in New Zealand. Now, there are multiple constraints around that. Some of it is to do with the skilled workforce that we've already talked about. Some of it is to do with our low levels of R&D investment. Some of it's to do with the transport constraints that the city knows all too well. So to get a proper integrated solution, you could worry and stress yourself entirely about the legislative framework, which does need to be looked at, or we could do some practical things in those areas.
In terms of encouraging business, where do you stand on a corporate tax reduction? Stephen Joyce?
Would love to if I ever found the room. I genuinely believe that. Can I just say, just before you get there though, in terms of the productivity question, what I think Grant misses a bit, the most important thing to get improvement in productivity is greater investment in businesses, because fundamentally you bring in a new machine, you get more done for the same number of people. That's the reality of it. And that needs to happen across the economy. And actually it has been happening. If you look at the rate of business investment, it's post-GFC it came up quite a bit, and it's coming up a bit right now. And what drives that? What drives that level of business investment? And that's confidence in the settings that are going to be in place before you make that call. that you're confident that actually you're going to be able to get out there and make the most of that big piece of kit. Otherwise, why would you buy it? And so when people start talking about capital gains taxes, they start talking about restricting migration, and they start talking about not doing trade deals, that's the sort of stuff that stops businesses being willing to invest in that bit of kit that's going to make them more productive and achieve, which then turns into more productivity across the whole of the economy. So I think that's really important.
To answer your question, Mark, no, that's not in our plans.
Would you like to? I mean, it's not in the plans because, like as Stephen Joyce said, like to do it, but can't afford it. Would you do it if you could afford it?
All of us would like to be paying less tax, Mark, but there's lots of things in our society that we want and that we need. And, the other, I'll answer the part of the capital gains question in a second, but I did note in the piece of paper that the EMA gave us, there was a big underlined "and," which you didn't read the next bit of, which said, "and balance what New Zealand wants as a civil society." And that is the question that we have to ask at this election, is the balance that we have between wanting to, everybody wants to pay less tax, but we do want to deliver quality public services. I think everybody in this room would like to see inequality reduced. None of us are happy about seeing levels of homelessness rise. So it is a balance between those two things. If I can come back on Stephen's comments around the tax issue, that's exactly the point. If we want to see more investment in the productive side of the economy, then we have to make sure we move people away from speculation in the housing market. Now, Stephen and his party actually did recognise this. They came into this term of government and put in place the bright line test, which says that if you flip a property that isn't your family home within 2 years, you'll pay tax at your effective marginal tax rate on that, a form of capital gains tax. We are taking the advice of the Treasury, who said that should be extended out to 5 years if you really want to have some impact on behaviour. That's the policy we're taking to this election, but we want the working group to look at how we get a better balance into the tax system to make sure that people are investing in the productive side of the economy, not into speculation and housing.
Would that include taxing, say, farms, small businesses? And that's what people want to know before they vote on the 23rd of September.
And what we're saying to them is that our focus is around getting the balance right between speculation and productive investment. The working group are the experts. They will do their job and make recommendations to us. We've said it won't include the family home. If you look at other capital gains taxes that are in place around the OECD, most of them actually have exemptions in terms of a certain level of profit that you're allowed to take before it gets taxed when a business is sold. It's usually on realisation. It's not usually on any kind of annual turnover. But what we're saying, Mark, is this is the direction of travel. Now, I appreciate some people aren't going to like it. So I'm not under any illusion. But what we're saying very clearly is we're going to extend that bright line test out to 5 years. And the purpose of this working group is to get a better balance in our tax system.
But if the working group came back and said, look, we think it'd be fairer to put a capital gains tax on business and farming, would you go, all right, fair enough, we'll accept it? I mean, don't you have to take some responsibility yourselves in terms of what you're prepared to look at?
Yeah, and we are. We're taking responsibility for that right now. We're being completely transparent we're being completely transparent with New Zealanders that we will listen to the experts when they come back. We will design a tax system that is better balanced and fairer. But Mark, it's much more honest to do that than it is. Well, no, it is. It's much more honest to do that, Stephen. So in 2008, when John Key said we're not going to raise GST, you then had a working group which recommended GST raising, and you did that. That's somehow more honest than us saying, here's the direction of travel we want. We have a housing crisis in New Zealand. We have the lowest home ownership rate in more than 60 years, and we have a tax system that favours speculation. Wouldn't you want to look at all of the options for what to do about
So
that?
if it was all right for them over, as you say, the GST argument, Stephen Joyce, then why is it wrong for Labour to apply the same thing?
Well, firstly, it's over to them. If they don't want to tell people they want to do a capital gains tax on businesses and farms before the election, I'm as happy as a sandboy. I think that's fantastic because everybody will assume that that's exactly what they're going to do. And you heard Grant this morning, that's exactly what he wants to do.
No, it's not what I said,
It is what he wants to do.
No, it's not what I said.
So I think that's fine. But I think it's a weird thing to say that you want to improve productivity and you want to shift investment into businesses and away from houses, but leave open the idea that you would actually tax the capital gain, whether it's realised or not, on investing in businesses and in farms. It just doesn't make any sense to me. But that's in terms of the question about 2010. Well, I would just point out that in 2010 when the GST went up, we went to very massive levels to make sure that nobody was worse off through that process.
Yeah.
I think that's why we got elected in 2011, but I don't hear that from Grant
Yeah,
either.
but the principle, Stephen, is about transparency. We are being transparent about the direction of travel. We're saying to New Zealanders we want a better balance in the tax system. And I think actually people who go to work every day and pay tax on every dollar that they earn look at someone who makes 30 grand from flipping an investment property and doesn't pay any tax on that and says, I want a fairer system.
Look,
we need to look at the options for that.
Before I open up the questions, just want to move on to employment law. And there is, I mean, you talk to business owners and people, Grant, there is a fear that if there's a Labour government comes in, we're back to the old days of the national awards and central bargaining, and specific industries are going to lose control.
Yeah, no. Look, I mean, I asked people to look at the track record of sort of industrial disruption and who was in government when there were high levels of industrial disruption. I think the Labour Party can hold its head high there. Look, we want to see wages grow, and we've been very clear about the fact we want to see lifts in the minimum wage and so on from there. And we want to see a system where workers can bargain collectively and know that will happen in good faith. And I look to businesses like Air New Zealand and Fonterra, where they have worked very closely across their workforce to see how they can drive productivity and actually how they can include their workers in the benefits of growth. And you saw the example with Air New Zealand the other day, being able to give that dividend back to their workforce. That actually is partly driven by the way they've gone about their industrial relations. So, our policies are out there. It's kind of in the name, Mark. We do want to make sure that Labour's share of wealth continues to grow. In New Zealand, it's actually been going backwards for some time, and we need to make sure that we do get New Zealanders a fair go. Well, Stephen's shaking his head. Last year, 2/3 of people got a wage rise that was less than the rate of inflation.
Stephen, Joyce, where is National at on this?
Oh, we think the employment relations settings are the right ones for New Zealand because they reflect the reality of New Zealand, which, as I said, leaving aside the example of Fonterra and Air New Zealand, is a nation of small businesses and small industries which are all different. Now, Grant's idea of a fair awards system where everybody in the manufacturing sector gets together and we determine the fair level of standards, minimum standards, which end up being the de facto standards for the manufacturing sector, I think would be a disaster for the now highly varied, highly niched New Zealand manufacturing sector, which all has different industries that it's dealing with. These days, it's a different world. And I look across the country, we've got hundreds and hundreds of these companies. It started out as quite general engineering firms back in the day, but are now doing very specialist niche products that they're selling internationally, and all of them are selling into different markets. And to suggest that they could somehow have a national system of standards and awards for those industry, for manufacturing as a whole, is, I just think, wrong in the modern world.
I just want to ask you both a very quick question. It's about something that a lot of employers are concerned about, the Holiday Act and its implementation, the practicalities of it. I mean, some aspects of that they're really struggling with. Are both of you willing to have a look at that?
Yes, is the short answer. I mean, I think, and I don't think there's any doubt that there have been problems with the implementation. We're not backing away from the importance of New Zealanders getting the holidays that they need, but we're very happy to sit down and see how we can make it work more effectively. I know one of the bills that I wrote and ended up passing through Parliament was the Mondaysing of Anzac Day and Waitangi Day, and having very satisfiedly said to myself, fantastic, look at what we did. I got waves of emails from people who don't regularly work on Mondays telling me that I was disadvantaging them, let alone the employers. So, we understand that this is a tricky area and we do need to sit down and talk about it.
Stephen, Joyce, you accept it needs some work?
Yeah, and actually it's good to hear Grant's interested in that, because I do think if we could, the trouble is it gets politicised very quickly, and if we could actually try and get
There was a review though, wasn't there?
There was that?
A review?
Yeah,
in 2012?
Yeah, there was, and the way to deal with it, I think, is actually if we could put the partisan politics aside on this one, because actually there's a couple of fundamental problems, and as we all know, you've got to calculate the holiday pay two ways and do it in a dynamic way, which then has to be constantly recalculated. And if somebody if we go through a technical way of resolving that, the danger is that somebody can pop their heads up and say, oh, well, this person then gets slightly less, or this person gets slightly more. but it's actually truly at very, very small levels. Now, I agree with Grant, everybody's got to get their holiday pay, but we must be able to get together as a parliament and make something a bit simpler than what we've got at the moment.
All right, I want to open it up to you guys. There
Dangerous
might be
outbreak of agreement.
questions here. Who's got a question from the floor? Start over here. Hang on, we'll bring you the mic just because we're streaming this around the country, so all the other members.
Streaming it live?
Oh yes, this is big, Steve.
I didn't do my hair.
Yeah.
I know, you've committed to that new
I'll lend you my
RMA policy live. That's great.
All right.
I watched the. Is this on?
Yes,
Anyhow, I watched the Q&A session on Sunday, and I didn't appreciate that Labor wouldn't sign the TPP on the basis of foreigners buying residential property. And one of the points that you made was, well, Australia has that exemption. But my understanding of Australia is that foreigners can buy property as long as it's new. Now, given that, when I went to university, which was unfortunately quite some time ago, we all dreamed about a free trade agreement with Japan. And so to jeopardise that sort of surprises me. And I would have thought you would have to think there was something really significant about foreigners buying new residential property to jeopardise that agreement. What is that significant problem?
Well, obviously there's been some data collected around foreign buyers in New Zealand. We don't believe that data is anywhere near reflective of the real situation. Too many categories of people have been left out of that, too many vehicles that people have been using to purchase property is there. So, we do think there's a significant issue. 2 points to clarify for you. That Australian policy is our policy. So if it's a new build, we're absolutely fine with that. It's about the purchase of existing property. So it is the same exemption. The second thing is that, we are in a position now, and the government would like you to believe that you can't possibly reopen these discussions. Well, actually the reality is with the US leaving, virtually every country has something that it accepted with the US in it, that it's uncomfortable with, that it wants to take another look at, and where it's something that is actually already held by other parties to the agreement. We just don't believe that it's so difficult or so impossible that we can't get back into that. I used to work at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. My favourite saying from those days was from my Mexican colleague who said that even the last minute of the last hour of the last day has 60 seconds in it. It's always possible to keep working on these agreements and keep finding the best outcome for New Zealand. There is definite benefit in trade agreements with Japan, and we need to keep striving for a good quality agreement that gets our exporters into there.
Do you want to make a quick comment, Stephen George?
Yeah, a couple of things. I actually think it has to be a really important thing. What I mean is a real showstopper. Otherwise, we should go ahead. The thing is that Grant's right at one level. Every country has a shopping list of things it would like to change, and this is 11 countries. So we either all hold hands and jump together later this year and say, actually, notwithstanding, there's all sorts of things we'd like to judgment call of how do we get the best outcome for New Zealand. And when you look at that as housing stats, and they are accurate actually, the non-tax residents are 3% in and about 3% out. And then you look at the comparison between the Auckland housing market and the Sydney housing market where they have this rule, and you sort of look to yourself and say, well, I can't see that much difference there. So what are we actually dying in a ditch over? I think it would just be better if New Zealand takes the lead. We do well from trade because we have a small domestic market. So the world and our region needs little countries like us to pop up alongside the Australians and the Japanese and say, hey, let's do this and get on with it.
All right, we've got a question from Stephen Selwood from Infrastructure New Zealand.
Yeah, thanks very much. The conversation touched on the RMA before, and you mentioned the partnership between EMA, Property Council and Infrastructure New Zealand, as well as the Environmental Defence Society. And we've, as you know, looked at this in quite some considerable detail and really come to the conclusion that it's not just the RMA that's the root of the challenges we have in front of us. As how you touched on, Grant, it's the wider legislation, the Local Government Act, Land Transport Management and other pieces of law. But it's more than that too. It's around local government structures, how they're funded, the complex relationships between regional councils and districts, big districts, small districts, capability, no capability. And so, when business has to engage with that sort of environment, that's a real handbrake on productivity. So our view as you know, is that we need a arm's length kind of consideration of all of this. And I guess my question really centres on that. Between the two of you, you command circa 80% of the vote in this election. If we could have a non-partisan or bipartisan kind of approach to this issue, you know, maybe we might be able to grapple these wider issues. Would you both support an independent arm's length review of those issues?
Grant, you start.
Look, I do think we need to review them. I mean, and by nature, there'll be some independence to that review because we can't do it ourselves and we have to involve the business community and others in that. I think the core point behind your question is exactly the one that I was trying to make, that thinking that changing the RMA or ripping it up is some kind of silver bullet to how we get sustainable growth in New Zealand is just unrealistic. And I think everyone here in Auckland is very well aware of a council that's right up against its debt limits, that we do need to be more inventive in the way that we find financing for the long-term infrastructure needs of this city. We've given some ideas about that ourselves with things like the regional fuel tax, the infrastructure bond ideas, targeted rates where there's value uplift. So we think we need to do that. I do believe that we need a conversation about how local government's funded. So the short answer to your question is happy to look at all of those things together within a review framework because that's a better way than just looking at the RMA. But there are things we can do along the way as well.
All right, let's leave it at the short answer. I mean, Stephen Joyce, you said you've been frustrated for 9 years, you didn't have the numbers to do bank change. Hasn't he got a point? Isn't this thing so important that a bipartisan approach is the best way to tackle it? And do you think the things that Stephen outlined are the things you should be looking at?
I think the things that Stephen outlined are indeed the things that we should be looking at, and the Productivity Commission in its short, pithy 500 and something page report has said pretty much the same sort of stuff. But where you get it quite quickly in terms of bipartisanship is you get to some quite crunchy issues which would have to resolve first, otherwise you will just end up, to Grant's point, you'll just end up doing a long review, and because everybody hasn't started from a position of, oh, we want to do some change, you'll end up basically coming back with the consensus, unfortunately, the sort of strained consensus that we have at the moment, and that the Parliament tends to be split, roughly 50-50, on those that think that actually we should be doing more to simplify the process of planning and making sure that things can happen more quickly, and those that are against that. And I think that's a significant handbrake on the whole thing. So if you put those two groups together, then you'll still roughly come up with the same thing that you've got now. So the public and businesses get to choose that over the next few weeks. I mean, that's the wonderful thing about having an election, is you get the opportunity to have that say as to what you're going to put together, and that's one of the issues that's out there. Can I just raise on the funding thing? I actually think, yes, we do need more funding tools, but at the end of the day, you're shaking down the same person, whether it's a ratepayer or a taxpayer. And so there's this sort of suggestion that somehow regional fuel tax is better because then the council doesn't have to pay for it. Well, it's the same people paying. I actually think the real opportunity is to bring in more private sector funding into some of this infrastructure. There's no reason why every single, I'm not talking about running a toll road through Penlink necessarily, but there's no reason why every single big piece of new infrastructure has to be funded centrally. And in fact, we're building roads at the moment that are exact opposite. So let's get the councils into that space, and that's what we're doing with Crown Infrastructure Partners.
Just two very quick responses, because Mark doesn't want me to go on long. I do just want to make the point that the Labour Party did make the offer to work with National around particularly issues to do with urban planning. We did, however, have at the base of that the core principles, Part 2 principles of the RMA we wanted to protect, and that was, unfortunately for National, they couldn't say that they would do that, and so that fell over. Secondly, on the regional fuel tax, I think most people in Auckland know that Aucklanders need to contribute their bit to solving the transport issues, and the rest of New Zealand thinks that as well.
Look, to finish up, I mean, judgment is going to be a very important quality for whoever takes over or continues in the reins of the Finance Minister. So this question is one that'll test that for you. Stephen Joyce, Bledisloe Cup tomorrow night. Your prediction, please.
Well, I didn't actually see the game last weekend because we were getting up the next morning for Q&A. Separately, I must hasten to add. I don't want you guys thinking that we're getting that close. breakfast, dinner, yeah. I didn't ring him as we watched the rugby or anything like that, but I didn't get to see the game. But I understand that for the first 50 odd minutes we played pretty well.
Stunning.
So a stunning game. So if we play half as well this weekend for the whole 80 minutes, I reckon we're looking pretty good.
Grant?
Interestingly, in light of announcements that have been made this week, under the roof in Dunedin, Mark, the All Blacks will run absolutely rampant.
All right, another
30 or 40.1.
final question. On the 24th of September, which one of you do you think will be talking to Winston?
Actually, the truth is neither of us, because there are people whose
above your pay grade
who are a
above
little
your
above
pay
us
grade,
who'll be having
And he's already said
conversations.
he's not going to deal with it until October the 12th.
Look,
So if you're going to put it in his hands, you'll have to wait.
I appreciate your time. Can we please welcome back EMA CEO Kim Campbell? Thanks, Kim.
Thanks, Mark.
Cheers.
Well, thank you both, Grant and Stephen. I do have to remark that the civility is really appreciated because we actually are discussing ideas, and we just don't have people snarling at each other. And it's a wonderful relief. And also, it's noteworthy how accessible you folk are. I mean, last night we had Simon Bridges at a small meeting in Tauranga. We've had Paul Goldsmith here. We've had Andrew Little. There's a constant dialogue. So we really do get a sense of both the sorts of people that we're dealing with and also their ideas, and that's deeply appreciated. I want to thank Val and the team who put this on at very short notice, and thank you all for being with us this morning. And also you, Mark, as I say, world famous in New Zealand, very familiar voice on the radio and on television. I think you moderated it wonderfully well. Here at EMA, there is a constant stream of excitement, and I would welcome you to our next event. Francis Valentine will expand your thinking about artificial intelligence. We have a taking charge of absenteeism course, a taking charge of dismissal, and finally on the 21st of September, the extravaganza Go Global, which we are hosting, and of course, in the context of New Zealand's trade agenda, it is the premier event in New Zealand every year. People from all over the world, and it's a big event. You're all welcome to come at a small consideration of some $200 miserable. You will be welcome there. So, the registration forms are on our website. So I just couldn't let the moment pass with a bit of a commercial plug. That was mainly it. So thank you for coming. There are some sandwiches and stuff at the back of the room. Put them in your handbag if you can't stay to eat them. You're more than welcome here, and some terrible coffee also before you go home. So thanks very much for everybody, and we'll see you next time.